Let me welcome you to the forum at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. This evening we're honored to welcome a distinguished friend of the school, John Kenneth Galbraith. Professor Galbraith will be delivering the 1988 Brittanica Award Lecture on, quote, the great economic systems, capitalism and socialism in transition. Let me begin by stressing the unique nature of the Brittanica Award. While many prizes exist for achievements advancing knowledge in a specific field, this award's purpose is to recognize individuals with, and I quote, an acknowledged skill in the communication of knowledge and a passion for the dissemination of learning for the benefit of mankind, close quote. Having said all this, a brief review of Ken Galbraith's many talents may lead some of you to wonder if perhaps the folks at Brittanica had him in mind when they created the award. After all, this is the man whom Ted Kennedy has called, quote, the closest thing America has in our generation to a Renaissance man. Even those who disagree with Galbraith's view admit the power of his words. Bill Buckley, who's never been described as his favorite advocate, once described Galbraith as, quote, unquestionably the most influential socialist in the Western world and the most eloquent and resourceful advocate of that social disease. Born and raised on a farm in Ontario, Canada, Galbraith inherited his combination of unvarnished liberalism and irreverent wit from his father, a local agitator known to make political speeches from atop a large manure pile and then apologize for speaking on the Tory platform. After earning a BS from the University of Toronto in 1931 and an MS and PhD in agricultural economics from Berkeley in 1934, Galbraith worked briefly with the Roosevelt administration before returning to the academy. He was an instructor at Harvard until 1939, when he became an assistant professor at Princeton. After the outbreak of World War II, Ken Galbraith left Princeton to serve as the head of the wartime office of Price Administration. After that, chief of the Strategic Bombing Survey and a director of the State Department's Office of Economic Security Policy, before he returned to Harvard in the economics department. This appointment that was ardently opposed by many who rejected his liberal politics, as well as his assertions that he would always remain true to agricultural economics. Eventually, those objections having been overruled and his political activities continued, Galbraith took leaves of absence to work on the campaigns of Adlai Stevenson, John Kennedy, Eugene McCarthy, and he also served as Kennedy's ambassador to India. That last appointment drew considerable fire, and President Kennedy is reported to have defended himself by quipping, quote, I wanted to get Ken as far as possible away from Washington. In between all of the leaves, Galbraith is rumored to have taught a few classes, although I must admit that students have reported more sightings since his retirement in 1975. And what a retirement it's been. Ken Galbraith continues to be an astonishingly prolific writer, with almost 30 books to his name, including his most recent book, Capitalism, Communism, and Coexistence, written with Stanislav Minchikov and published just this year. But if Galbraith's work has produced many critics, it's because he's spoken out so forcefully and so widely against well-loved orthodoxies. As Gunnar Myrdal said, quote, Ken Galbraith comes in as a fresh wind against the old beliefs of conventional economists, and he's very much needed in America. Whichever side you take in his economic debates, I'm sure you will agree with me that Ken Galbraith's work is chock full of useful insights, especially for students who are training to be public servants at a school like this. Let me close with just a few. He says, quote, politics is the art of the possible. It consists in choosing between the disastrous and the unpalatable. Or on another occasion, Adopt, where appropriate, a modest aspect of menace. Many public officials will go against their convictions to avoid a fight, and some are conveniently lacking in convictions. For those of you who are here from the State Department in the school, he says, quote, "It's important to write about the State Department without making it funny." But perhaps most importantly for all of us thinking of a high or low office, he says, if it's at all possible, be mentally accommodated to catching the plane out of Washington on any given morning. Please join me in welcoming a good friend of the school, Ken Galbraith.
Graham, for that lovely introduction. Much of it true. Thank you very much for being here this evening. And I must say thank you very much for these extraordinary engineering arrangements. One of the great advantages of being a Harvard professor is that you have a new generation always coming along which has not heard your old stories. And I venture to tell, as I've often told as I look at this arrangement, of an event a quarter of a century ago at a large meeting in Washington when I was called into the presence of General de Gaulle. I addressed this story entirely to the Dean of the Kennedy School. And General de Gaulle said, "Professor, what is your philosophy of your great height?" Well, I had said this in a book. There's plagiarism is common in our time, including the plagiarism of oneself. And I said, "Well, my general, I was from president, we tall men are taller than anyone else. Therefore, we're more visible. It follows we're more closely watched." You'll all remember that marvelous comment of H.L. Mencken, his marvelous definition of a conscience, that still small voice that tells you someone might be watching. And we're more closely watched, therefore our behavior is better. And therefore the world instinctively trusts tall men. General Gaulle said, "Magnifique." And then, in a rolling voice, which I can't possibly imitate, he said, "Anent, Graham Allison and many others," he said, "there is one thing you have forgotten. The small men must be treated without mercy." There has not, for many years, been a lecture such as this, such as the one I offer on this otherwise pleasant autumn evening, which hasn't opened with a reference to change. I speak to you in a time of great political, economic, and social change. You've all heard that. Well, I am tonight firmly in this tradition. I wish to speak of change. But I wish to speak also of the very great forces that in modern public life and thought, and to some extent in academic life and thought, are in resistance to change, in resistance to change reality. The change I cite tonight is in two circumstances affecting the international and the military policy of the superpowers. And the resistance to change lies in what I shall call our commitment to, I put these words in quotes, institutional truth. That's distinct from truth. The changes are in the internal character and external manifestations of the two great economic, social, and political systems, capitalism and socialism, or often called communism. Changes that systems that for 70 years have been dominant on the world scene. The institutional truth with which I deal is strikingly revealed in the organizational resistance to acceptance of these changes. The changes in the socialist, communist world, dominated by the Soviet Union, and in the capitalist world, epitomized and led since World War II by the United States, are, I think, not in doubt. They are visibly obtrusive. In the case of some, there is an element of déjà vu in mentioning them. All, nonetheless, are in conflict with and in striking degree denied by the institutional truth. For many years after Lincoln Steffens returned from Russia in 1919 to tell Bernard Baruch, and I quote, "I have been over into the future and it works," one of the more spectacularly premature economic observations of all time, there was an uneasy, deeply subjective feeling that in our relations with the Soviet Union, we were contending with a dangerously compelling economic order. This was evident in the impassioned oratory that condemned the Soviet system. Beneath the rhetoric was a legacy of fear. And indeed, in the years between the wars, the Soviets built a powerful industrial base, avoided the unemployment and general economic disaster of the Great Depression, and then sustained the vast armies that defeated Hitler. This contributed notably to one of our most common social phenomena. That is the compelling belief of fortunate Americans rejoicing greatly in their good fortune that somewhere there lurks an infinitely powerful, deeply insidious design for their expropriation. American conservatives have always been as much, perhaps more, committed to the Marxist inevitability of socialism than Marxists themselves. Paranoia here, in turn, had its Russian counterpart. The 1918 military interventions of the Allies, the onslaught of Hitler bent on destroying the communist infection, the years of exuberant capitalist success following World War II, all were seen as a threat to the socialist system. Capitalism was not thought disposed to tolerate a rival system. It was awaiting the opportunity to obliterate it. There was similarly a source of fear for both Soviets and Americans in what appeared to be a common commitment to aggressive and, for a time, successfully exercised international influence. Soviet expansionism, it was called in the West. We should always be etymologically aware that if anything is evil, we attach always the three letters ISM. And capitalist or imperialism, as it was denoted in Moscow. And here, too, there was substance. In 1961, when I went to India as a point man for American imperialism, Soviet power seemingly stretched undiminished from the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin to the port of Haiphong. The commonplace reference, lodged in all professional conversation, was to the Sino-Soviet bloc. The Eastern European satellites, the most visible evidence of Soviet expansionism, also seemed solid, successful, and secure. There were outposts of marked importance in North Africa, Indonesia, and, of course, in the Western Communist parties. The Korean conflict, wanting the economy of South Korea, was a remarkable exercise in economic foresight. The Korean conflict, in the general view, made evident this commitment to socialist expansion. So did the overt Soviet promise of support to wars of national liberation. There was a formidable concern in Washington as how we could prevent India from falling under communist control. A misfortune I had already come to think that no really perceptive communist would wish to contemplate. But similarly evident was the American influence on the American side. There was CETO, CENTO, NATO, also the further web of John Foster Dulles' treaties, also a strong moral position by the United States in Central and South America, and much of Africa. The Soviets saw all this, not surprisingly, as evidence of the American imperialist intention, or, at a minimum, of a determined policy of encirclement. Next, contributing to these reciprocal fears was the military experience. In World War II, there was the American vision of the enormous power of the Soviet armies as they drove the Wehrmacht back to Berlin and beyond, and the combination of gratitude and fear that this engendered. And again, there was the counterpart concern of the Soviets, our evident advantage in naval and aerial arms and weaponry, and above all, our pioneer breakthrough in nuclear weaponry. Here, along with economic achievement and imperial ambition, was the third source of reciprocal fear and tension. Finally, there was the compelling question of human rights, the evident incompatibility of one system that avowed them and another that did not. Our commitment was admittedly imperfect as regards minorities, especially blacks. It was also, as is still the case, unduly identified with the private ownership of productive property. Dictators who accepted or now accept private property could be and are forgiven much else. Nonetheless, the difference here between the two systems was great, inescapable, and as I've just said, an evident source again of incompatibility. To be friendly with the Soviet Union was to be acquiescent on this great issue of human rights. It is a mistake, I believe, to make light of these differences and these fears as expressed in their time, to say, as some have said, that they were invented for military or political purpose. They, especially the fears, were very real, and they would become the foundation of foreign and military policy in both the great powers. In doing so, they became, I suggest, the sources of the institutional truth that continues to control belief and guide policy to this day. And now the singular and inescapable fact is that the sources of these fears have, as regards substance, greatly diminished. This is evident, I believe, when we examine them one by one. I'm always reminded when I pick up a glass of ice water of an occasion in Indiana 2 or 3 years ago, where I was on a panel with I think I'll leave his name unknown. He was from the eastern South, so I spare our friends from Tupelo, Mississippi from any blame. And halfway through his extraordinary eloquent address, he ran out of moisture, had to have a glass of water, which came up jangling as this does, Graham, with ice. And he said in great anger, "Don't you all know that ice water is very bad for the vocal cords?" And I suppose there were 500 people there, maybe 1,000 who joined me in thinking what a wonderful thing ice water could be. As I said, we must examine these sources of fear one by one. Reciprocal and threatening economic success as a source of fear almost totally disappeared. The Soviet Union, China, and the Eastern European countries, their considerable past achievements notwithstanding, are now openly struggling with grave and perhaps even intractable economic problems. The confidence of an earlier time has been all but lost. The present preoccupation is with bureaucratic sclerosis and the strategies of release from that sclerosis and reform. Or, a somewhat neglected point, which I would emphasize, there is concern with the difficulty that a planned economy has in meeting the highly diverse products, designs, and services and styles of the modern high-consumption society. What served very well for satisfying the primitive wants or building basic Stalinist industry does not satisfy consumer wants. Neither Marx nor Lenin saw an economy in which cosmetics or well-styled couture would be a proletarian need. A primary concern in all the socialist world is now what concessions can be made to the market without surrendering the basic structure of socialism. Similarly, in the capitalist world, and especially in the United States, we have been, in our case, sustaining our living standard only by massive internal and external debt creation. And in our traditional areas of industrial achievement, we are no longer fully competitive with Japan and the new countries of the Pacific Basin. As I say, there's an air of the commonplace here. We should note that for each speech in the Congress in the past year on the political threat of the Soviet Union, there were at least 10 on the economic threat of Japan. The dollar, once above challenge as the reference currency of the world, is now viewed with caution and on some recent occasions with disdain. No one will suppose that either American capitalism or Soviet socialism any longer projects that total image of success which once induced fear in the other country. We have still, to be sure, the normal manifestation of conservative paranoia as regards socialism. But increasingly, I think, we recognize it as a clinical disorder. In the last election, the danger of a descent into socialism was no longer cited. The danger of liberalism and the ACLU had to serve. The change has been even more spectacular as regards the once avowed dangers of Soviet expansionism and capitalist imperialism. Here, the retreat has been massive, inescapable. The Soviets have experienced the traumatic break with China, perhaps in many ways the single most important foreign policy development of the post-war years. Also, there is a visibly weakened position in Eastern Europe. Also, the loss of effective influence in Egypt, Algeria, Ghana, Indonesia. Also, the shrinkage and indeed the near disappearance of the Western European communist parties. Also, the disaster in Afghanistan, and now the descent of the ethnic communities within the USSR. Our experience, viewed over the last 25 years, has not been different. Our situation has changed progressively ever since I surrendered imperialist power in 1963. Central and South America are no longer ours on call. Only Grenada is now ours for the asking. Those who seek expansion of American power can't even assert themselves adequately in the unfortunate Republic of Nicaragua. Cito and Cento have gone with the wind, of which they largely consisted. So also the Dulles bilateral treaties. In these last days, Benazir Bhutto, an independent Radcliffe voice, has projected herself onto the Pakistan scene in displacing our military acolytes there, at least for the time being. NATO survives, but it no longer accords us the automatic support we once enjoyed. Travel to NATO meetings is known to be pleasant and socially rewarding, but no one for some years has suggested that the meetings themselves are intellectually demanding or that anyone remembers what was decided. And we had the traumatic experience and lesson of Vietnam. To a remarkable extent, we and the Soviets have run into the same two problems. The first has been the intense, unrelenting desire of all national entities, of all countries and their governments, to be free from external authority. This, in the post-colonial era, has been one of the most powerful influences of the time. It has overcome the deep-seated tendency and error since Rome to see one's imperial authority as a reward and blessing to others. The second problem is the manifest inapplicability of the model of either mature socialism or developed capitalism in the third world. The socialist disaster, here evident in Afghanistan, Ethiopia, and Mozambique, has been particularly great. And this should not have been to any good socialist surprise. On nothing did Marx insist more adamantly than that socialism could come only after the socializing, as he said, influence of capitalism. But we too have also suffered from the supposition that what is sound economic policy in the United States must somehow be right for India, Africa, or Latin America. Against nothing in my years in India did I struggle so hard as the belief in agricultural matters that what was right in Iowa was automatically right in the Punjab. I might say, as Graham indicated in his introduction, I was the only recent ambassador with a first degree in agriculture, specializing in animal husbandry. To my agriculturists, it was an enormous relief when I left. I have been asked many times, dozens of times, whether in my years as ambassador I controlled the CIA. I must tell you that coming as I did from the real bureaucratic struggles of World War II, which had a ferocity never before or never since known, I had no difficulty with those people whatever. They were a bunch of patsies as compared with the agricultural republic, which did not think there should be any control of any kind from anybody above. Returning to the change, there has now also been the massive alteration in the military relationship. Here one risks a rapid descent into the trite. Any modern conflict brings the unacceptable risk of nuclear exchange. This neither capitalism nor communism, both highly sophisticated designs for ordering economic process, this neither would survive. Accordingly, capitalism and communism now sit on the same side of the table, facing the common threat of nuclear war which would destroy both. Some months ago, I read of a draft proposal emanating from some imaginative precinct in Washington, calling for the construction of special underground shelters for safeguarding real estate deeds, stock certificates, other evidences of property ownership, and perhaps their principal custodians, so that in the aftermath of a nuclear war, survivors would have a valid claim on their property assets. Were there indeed such survivors, their claim would be small as compared with what they could have from the newly available public domain. There is a further possible change in the larger military nexus. That concerns a question that is not asked, of whether the industrial state can be a successful object of military action and resulting occupation. From the earliest times, agricultural regions were a useful fruit of conquest. Farmers or peasants and artisans, whatever their ethnic, religious, or other objection, would perform more or less equally well under whoever was their present or ultimate aggressive master. They would provide revenue and manpower to one master about as well as to another. No one can suppose this to be so of the modern, complex, intricately demanding industrial economy. Can the Russians really imagine that they could take over and operate the Japanese economy? A thought, as they contemplate their military expenditure, that has almost certainly occurred to the Japanese. Or the Italian economy. We recently heard alarming references to the undefended, quote, southern flank, unquote, of NATO. Or do we wish to have responsibility for the Polish economy or that of Russia? I mention these matters not as a final judgment, but as things we should now be discussing. As we see armed troops along every frontier, let us ask, is what lies behind any longer that enticing? Reading of the alarm last winter over the withdrawal of the F-16s from the environs of Madrid, I couldn't help wondering if the worry was not over a new Ottoman onslaught against the Knights of Malta. I do not here urge the withdrawal of our troops from Europe from overseas service. This is an enlarging experience. But let us not resist the thought that there is a change in the concept of territorial acquisition as between agriculture and modern, complex, sophisticated industry. Let us remember that after World War II, I was myself then involved, nothing was wanted so quickly, so ardently in Washington as to return Germany and Japan to German and Japanese industrial management. Finally, there has been movement, at least, on the matter of human rights. The Soviet Union has taken long steps toward open political expression. It is now engaged in a debate of startling vigor on economic and social policy and the means to a greater democratic participation in the affairs of state. This has a notable distance yet to go. One cannot, however, doubt the extent of the recent change. And we need also again to remind ourselves that our own position on these matters is not yet perfect. I personally am not greatly disturbed by those who would invade our right to decline the oath of allegiance. This is a matter where silent mental reservation serves admirably to those opposed. I am much more disturbed by the number of our fellow citizens for whom poverty, homelessness, and deprivation are fully as forceful in denying freedom and liberty as the actions of any state. Nothing more suppresses speech and action, nothing more suppresses liberty as abject, all-embracing poverty. More broadly, more vitally indeed, we must recognize that human rights are for all industrial countries, mature capitalist, mature socialist, less a virtue than a necessity. Let us note that in all modern industrial countries, there is a greater or less measure of freedom of expression, and in all the Western industrial countries, participation in the processes of government. This is because while poor peasant economies that are subject to the daily grind of existence can have their people kept in subordinate silence, in the advanced industrial country, this is not practical or possible. Politicians, public servants, trade union leaders, scientists, professors, journalists, poets, and students all demand to be heard and to participate in the tasks of government. So it is in the United States, and so I suspect it is coming to be in the USSR. There are more articulate Americans than can be kept quiet. There are, one judges, coming to be more articulate Russians than, as a practical matter, it is possible to subdue. We are right to avow the moral case for human rights, but we should not deny their utility, and perhaps I would argue even their inevitability in the modern, highly developed, highly diverse, diversely spoken economy of highly industrialized people. I now turn from these matters, from the great, and I venture to think largely undisputed changes I have cited, to the role of institutional truth. A certain stability in public thought and policy is not to be deplored. This is especially so under our own system, where every 4 or 8 years, the White House and the departments of government, especially the former, are invaded by men, and some women, with an unduly imaginative vision of what is theirs to change. But we must also recognize that all great organization, all great bureaucracy, has a deeply intrinsic resistance to change. And both our public and private life today are dominated by great organization. So it is here in the United States, and so it is even more so in the Soviet Union. The organizational factors resisting change are 5. There is first, in all great organization, the need for a unifying system of thought, commonly called a policy, or in military organization, a military doctrine. To this, all participants in that organization must in some measure adhere. The alternative, everyone proceeding on his or her independent, undisciplined course, would be chaos. There is, second, both a release from mental effort and a measure of pride in accepting the ruling idea or doctrine. Tolstoy, in a wonderful passage in War and Peace, tells of the relief, even pleasure, in surrendering all decision to the rule of the regiment. Institutional truth is our modern alternative to the painful processes of thought that we all, in some measure, seek to avoid. Third, there is safety in such surrender to the organizational view. It is a hard but inescapable fact that in all organized effort, it is often safer for the individual to be wrong with the majority than to be right alone. Fourth, there is the strong tendency of all organization to exclude the inconvenient voice. Here again, I venture to cite personal experience. In the early stages of our involvement with Vietnam, I was more than marginally concerned with our policy there. I felt with some knowledge of the larger region, some knowledge of Vietnam, that is in India, while capitalism and communism, that is in India, capitalism and communism were concepts irrelevant to most of the population, while foreign intervention in Vietnam, the Chinese, French, Japanese, and now ours, was by no means irrelevant. Also, from my background in agriculture, to which I again recur, I thought that herding people into strategic hamlets, so-called, was a particularly efficient design for the alienation of those so saved from communism. Also, as all indeed know, and then did know, that the government we supported in Saigon was oppressive, corrupt, and incompetent. And also, this was a somewhat later view, I didn't get this on my first visit there, that our sophisticated military establishment was badly designed for the elementary warfare there required, for a country where only the most discerning military ideologist could tell a capitalist jungle from a communist jungle. These are all points, parenthetically, which are wonderfully articulated in Neil Sheehan's brilliant recent book, A Bright Shining Lie. But I learned in those years that urging these matters was far from being a formula for popularity, or even inclusion. It would be said, well, we know where Galbraith stands, he's not very useful. And there was then a more disagreeable thought that certainly applied to some. Perhaps the individual motivated dissent had fallen under some adverse external institute. Maybe they have got to him. Such an organization is the frequent fate of the individual who challenges institutional truth. Fifth, and finally, there is vested personal and pecuniary interest. Not many of us wish to deny our past or admit to past error. I'm exceptional in that regard. Not many of us wish to deny. We have many countrymen and not a few scholars who have committed their lives to the concept of inevitable fear, inevitable tension, and inevitable conflict. This is a hard, cruel thing. It is a hard, cruel thing to have that lifetime commitment destroyed. It is a matter on which my sympathies are great. Who in academic life wishes to see those old lecture notes become obsolete? There are, we also know, great pecuniary rewards in established policy, great pecuniary rewards in the accepted international truth. Here, again, I verge on the trite. No one doubts the great financial interest in present military policy and in the concept of strain and tension that sustains that military establishment. The danger here was implanted in our thought and language by Dwight D. Eisenhower with his enduring reference to the military-industrial complex. All of the foregoing bears as institutional truth on American-Soviet relations, and especially it bears on the military nexus. On the one hand, the change. On the other hand, the strong resistance to change, the power of institutional truth, and the vested intellectual and economic interest that lies therein. The consequence is the present and highly visible anomaly in our present foreign and military action and policy. We have a dual policy, or at best, a wonderfully bifurcated attitude. Through the force of the change that I have here cited this evening, the force of the change in the relationship between the two great systems and their two principal exponents, has come the compelling pressure for association and compromise. Here, the reality asserts itself. This has been made evident in the 4 summits, the closer working relationship between Secretary of State and Foreign Minister, the INF Treaty, and an unprecedented increase in scientific, artistic, and other association, and the caution in the last election, which caused both spokesmen to be very cautious about anything that suggested old-fashioned confrontation with the Soviet Union. And now, beginning tomorrow night, it will be manifest in the nearly total tie-up of New York traffic as Mikhail Gorbachev comes to Wall Street. This, to repeat, is in response to the underlying changes that no leader, and certainly none in our politically responsive democracy, can resist. At the same time, and notably on military matters, where doctrine rules most strongly, where vested economic interest is great and perhaps decisive, we still have the full force of institutional truth. The 2 great systems, ours and that of the Soviet Union, are held to remain in bitter conflict. Expansionism is still assumed. Military parity, if not preeminence, is still sought. All frontiers are held to be deeply vulnerable. Both candidates in this election affirmed, as a matter of course, their commitment to the institutional truth that requires a strong defense. We accept that change has altered the basic relationships between the 2 superpowers, as by courtesy they are still called. Institutional truth is reflected especially in military doctrine or policy, in talk of needed weaponry, effectively denies that there has been any change. We have one policy in response to reality. We have another policy in response to institutional truth. I am not disposed to argue, as in the case of the troops in Europe, for any sudden, violent revision of past practice. I am inclined strongly to argue for subjecting this whole subject to a more acute and serious discussion. It will be evident that I regard the case for reality as being stronger than that of institutional truth. But it is not my purpose this evening to urge a particular course of action. You will be relieved to know that, those of you who are looking nervously at your watches. My purpose was to identify the wonderfully conflicting forces which, in a world of great organization and great change, come to control attitudes, speech, and action, and to ask you, by far the most distinguished and influential and articulate audience I will meet this year, to join in accepting and urging the new reality. Thank you very much.
Professor Galbraith is willing to undertake a few questions and answers. Because of the size of the audience, the microphones are spread to the side here. Since it is being recorded for rebroadcast on public radio, we ask you to step up to one of the microphones, and we are pleased to take your questions, but not speeches or counter speeches. So please, questions. Starting here at the right microphone.
Hi, Professor Galbraith. I'm just curious about the criteria by which they pick a Nobel Prize winner in economics, and I wondered if if you think anybody outside the ideological mainstream would ever come close.
I didn't cover that in my lecture, did I? There are always questions that are sufficient in the question rather than in the answer.
Let me see if I can get a comment by one of the less orthodox members of our faculty here, Bob Reich. Bob, would you make a comment on this question of orthodoxy and unorthodoxy? Can we stir you? No. Okay. Back to this microphone.
You mentioned that people still committed to what you call institutional truth are still engaged in a quest regarding military parity, if not predominance. I'm not sure that was the word. My question is about that in terms of nuclear weapons development and the nuclear arms race. While you haven't, you avoided being specific, I'd be interested to hear your comment on this. Your former colleague Paul Nitze was here recently and spoke about, I think with some apparent conviction, of the importance of modernizing our nuclear weapons force in the realm of survivability and things of that nature. I would be interested to hear your view of an apparently otherwise a man committed to arms control who seems to be a strong proponent of a continuation of the nuclear arms race. How you see that kind of...
Well, Paul's an old friend of mine. We were colleagues on the Strategic Bombing Survey. At the end of the war ended for everybody else, continued for another 6 months with for George Ball, Paul Nitze, and myself, as the Air Force tried to suppress our analysis of their non-achievements during the war. Paul has all his life had one foot in the military-industrial complex, has all his life sought, I think perhaps unconsciously, to keep his credibility there, and at the same time using that credibility to make marginal changes. If Paul had come up here and advocated all the, as he should have, the futility of further weapons deployment at a time of massive overkill, he would have well, it would have been a little difficult for Paul the next time he had to go over to the Pentagon. I say that not in any way critical of an old friend, just the kind of psychiatric analysis that we all extend.
Here at the left microphone.
Professor Galbraith, I wonder if you don't underestimate the value of some inertia in institutional policies. I wonder if you don't underestimate the value of inertia in some institutional policies. Gorbachev has been leader for a very few years, and the challenges he is undertaking suggest that it is perfectly possible that he will be overthrown and that there would be a return to the leaders in the mold of Chernenko, Brezhnev, and those before him. Wouldn't it be a little premature to change our whole policy of 40 years just on the basis of one man's what might be just a flash in the pan?
Of course, I don't deny that for a moment, and I think but it will be evident from what I've said that I see inertia on both sides. And I would only tell you, in a kindly way, that don't go looking for excuses for avoiding the subject of arms control. That is something which I don't want to see you do.
Up here in the right balcony.
Yes, what do you think of the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Accord, and can you predict some consequences?
The what?
The Free Trade Accord.
Oh, we've certainly gone far afield, haven't we?
Yes, we have.
I have, through all of my professional life, avoided the subject of international trade, and I'm delighted that others so occupy themselves, because it is entirely an ex ante, never an ex post discussion. Oh, there were some ex post discussions of McNary Haugen, but for all practical purposes, the specialist in international trade and the discussion of international trade tells what will happen. It never tells what has happened as a result of any particular action. And it would be my guess, as a one-time Canadian, looking at it from as my family does still, from north of the border, now looking at it from the south, that even this young and magnificently intelligent audience will 10 years from now not be able to tell the difference.
Here on the right hand.
One more of that.
I'm from the business school across the river, and someone...
Oh, don't apologize on the floor. I basically consider this our most distinguished school. Go ahead.
Read a very interesting article that you wrote for the Atlantic Monthly about 18 months ago regarding the parallels between 1929 and the late 80s. And one of our last cases in a course in macroeconomics for the first year was by Peter G. Peterson, where he said that given the massive external and internal debts that you mentioned in your speech, we're either going to be in for a hard landing or a soft landing, and a soft landing if the current administration is able to deal effectively with this massive internal and external debt, consumer debt, etc. My personal belief is it looks like we could be in for a hard landing in the short run. I just wondered if you shared that belief or not.
Well, that's a good question to end on. I must say Pete Peterson is an old friend of mine. We shared in the Atlantic Monthly article of mine and the article that he did for the New York Review of Books a few months later, the common belief that the stock market was in a state of uncontrolled speculation, that we had developed one of the oldest phenomena in economics, going back to the tulip mania in Holland in 1637, the vested interest in euphoria, the deep desire of people to believe in what was seeming to make them rich, and that the crash would come. I haven't been in agreement with Pete since he mobilized a massive group of CEOs, former secretaries of the Treasury, even got John Connolly out of the depths of Chapter 11 to sign an advertisement calling for what was taken to be the cause of the stock market crash, namely the federal deficit. That had been for years and nobody had worried about it. Suddenly it became important. It became important to close the deficit, although there was a careful suggestion that we should avoid anything that penalized incentive, a cover story for not putting any more taxes on the rich. I'm inclined to think that Pete, to some extent, spoiled his credibility in that particular initiative. And I would go on to say that you have, as regards the early future, two classes of economists: those who don't know and those who don't know that they don't know. And I belong to the first group.
Let me say a final word, if I can. Not only do we want to thank a good friend of the school in Harvard, Ken Galbraith, and tell us how much we would like to have him back, but it's also fitting, I think, that in this space tomorrow night at 8 o'clock, there'll be yet another forum event, which I've been asked to announce, and it's entitled Watergate, a 15-year perspective, a subject about which Ken is informed since he was a notorious member of what was at the time called the enemies list. This panel tomorrow night, looking back after 15 years at Watergate, will include Richard Kleindienst, the former Attorney General under President Nixon, Fred Thompson, the Minority Counsel to the Watergate Committee, Haynes Gorey, the Chief Correspondent of Time Magazine, Father Robert Drinan, who was a former member of the Watergate House Judiciary Committee, and Roger Porter of this faculty will be moderating it. Ken will not be here, but we'll hope we get him back here again sometimes very soon. So thanks very much.